Chapter 1. Get up. A cold voice rang in Chuck Cannon's ears. The next second, the quilt on him was completely lifted. Chuck rubbed his eyes and looked at the woman. He sighed and felt a little uncomfortable. The beautiful woman in front of him was Yvette Jordan, who was 4 or 5 years older than Chuck was. She was adopted by Chuck's grandfather and was groomed to be his bride since young. But since his grandfather's death, her attitude towards Chuck had become more and more terrible. "You useless piece of trash, your face even pisses me off." Yvette's beautiful face was full of disgust. Chuck frowned and tried not to take Yvette's words to heart. "Let me tell you, I have done my best to support you. If you don't behave yourself, I will chase you out of this house." Chuck put on his clothes and clenched his fists. "But you are my wifey." "No, I'm not. It was your grandfather who forced me to marry you. Did he ever ask me if I agreed? If I had a choice, how could I marry a good-for-nothing like you?" Chuck put on his clothes and stood in front of Yvette. "Wifey? Don't call me wifey. I'll warn you for the last time. The money that you use to eat and drink now is all mine. If you dare to call me wifey again, I'll let you die on the streets." Yvette snorted coldly and looked at Chuck with disdain. "But I'm sure that a trash like you won't be able to survive on the streets for long." Since Grandpa left, such humiliation was no longer strange to Chuck. His fragile self-esteem had been almost crushed by Yvette. Sometimes Chuck even doubted whether he was really a piece of trash. Wife, Yvette, I don't have any money." Chuck took a deep breath. He was just a freshman this year, and Yvette was not only a university lecturer but also owned a company. She was a rich person. "Look at yourself. You look like a beggar. It's disgusting." Yvette looked at Chuck disgustedly. Then she took out $200 from her bag and threw it on the ground. She turned around and left. Looking at the money on the ground, Chuck clenched his fists. In the end, he didn't pick up the money on the ground. He walked out of the house with his remaining self-esteem. Yvette's BMW drove out of the garage as Chuck stood by the roadside and watched. He was in the same university as Yvette, so they were heading in the same direction. However, Yvette's car didn't stop and drove past Chuck. "Get out of here and take the bus. A piece of trash doesn't deserve to ride my car." After saying that, Yvette stepped on the accelerator and left. Chuck gritted his teeth and looked at the BMW that had disappeared at the end of the road. His eyes were slightly red. "Yvette, you've gone too far." He was penniless now. His lunch money these days was borrowed from his classmates, and today was the day for him to return the money. Unfortunately, the $200 were too burdensome, and he couldn't pick it up. When he arrived at school, his worst fears came true. As soon as he walked to the school gate, Chuck happened to meet a student who lent money to him. Laura Jean was buying milk tea outside the school gate. When she saw Chuck, who was in a state of loss, she reached out and said, "Chuck, it's time to pay back the money, isn't it?" Chuck wanted to bury himself out of shame. He scratched his hair and said with embarrassment, "Well, give me one more day, I'll do part-time work. I'll pay you back the money latest by tomorrow." "No, how long have you been delaying? You have to return the money to me today." Laura said coldly, and there was no room for negotiation in her tone. Chuck sighed. "But I really don't have any money now." "You don't have money to ask your parents for it. Are you an orphan?" "You?" Chuck clenched his fist tightly. For as long as he could remember, he had been living with his grandfather. He had never seen his parents before. However, being called an orphan by Laura made him feel even more uncomfortable. "You're really an orphan? Well, I'll give you an extension until this afternoon, but you have to pay me $400. If you don't pay me back, I'll ask my boyfriend to bring someone to deal with you." Laura warned and left. Chuck stood still in his tracks. He was extremely sad. He had enough of such humiliation. Just as Chuck was thinking about what part-time job he was going to do, his phone rang. Chuck looked at the caller ID and saw that it turned out to be a foreign number. He was afraid that it was probably a swindler. However, when he thought of the online recruitment of mercenaries in Syria, which was quite popular recently, offering $8,000 a day, he became interested again. Although he knew it could be a scam, if it was true, he would definitely go to Syria without hesitation. "Hello," Chuck greeted. Unexpectedly, a flurry of words in Mandarin from on the other end of the phone. "Chucky, I am your mother." Chuck was stunned. He first felt that he had been made fun of others, but then he felt extremely sad. How could he have a mother? Chucky, don't blame me. I had no choice but to go abroad these years, but now I can finally return home. I will try my best to make up for the lost time with you. I will transfer $5 million and you can use it first. If it is all spent, call me. The strange conversation ended in a weird atmosphere. As soon as the call ended, a message arrived. Your account with the ending number 123 has been credited with $5 million, and the current balance is $5.83. Chuck was dumbfounded. His mother, whom he had never seen before, actually gave him $5 million. He looked at the text message and counted the zeros again and again, repeatedly confirming it more than a dozen times, and then went to the ATM machine to check if it was correct. He was ecstatic. That was $5 million. What more? It was his mysterious mother who casually gave him pocket money. Even Yvette, who was busy with her business, had less than $1 million, including her car and her savings. Chuck giggled and walked to the campus. At this time, Yvette, who was going to the public building for class, said with disgust after seeing Chuck, "Why aren't you in class but instead laughing here stupidly? I'm not going to class anymore." Chuck stood where he was and watched Yvette quietly. Yvette felt a little strange. She seemed to see a confident look in Chuck's eyes. Isn't he still the useless piece of trash? How dare he argue with her? Yvette was angry. How dare you talk back to me? If you have the guts, don't come to my house today. Chuck was also tired of being treated coldly by Yvette. He said disdainfully, "I'm not going back, I'll sleep elsewhere." Is this a joke? Now that I have $5 million, I don't need to look at Yvette's unhappy face anymore. Chuck thought to himself, "You? Great! I'd like to see how brave you are. From now on, if you dare to enter my house again, I'll break your legs." Chuck ignored Yvette and directly turned his back and left the school. Yvette stomped her feet angrily, but she couldn't do anything about it, so she turned around and went to class. Chuck, who had left school, took a taxi to the real estate agency in the city center. With this sum of money, the first thing Chuck wanted to do was to have his own house. After pushing the door open and entering, the real estate agency employees did not pay attention to Chuck, who was dressed ordinarily. This kind of person was either looking for a part-time job, begging for food, or the type who wasn't interested in buying anything but just trying to enjoy the air-conditioned room. Later, when the manager of the store came out of the office, those lazy employees hurried up and asked, "Sir, what do you need?" "To buy a house." "To buy a house?" Natalie Xavier's big eyes narrowed. She stared at Chuck carefully for a long time. She had been a real estate agent for so long, but she had rarely misjudged someone. There may be 1 in 1,000 customers who would buy a house at less than 20 years old like Chuck, but all of them wore branded suits and drove high-end sports cars. "Sir, for your information, the cheapest house in the city is around $12,000 per square meter. Are you sure you want to buy it?" Natalie didn't want to waste time on this kind of person, so her tone became impatient. Chapter 2. "Yes, the cheapest one is $12,000, which means that a house of 100 square meters costs about $1 million. Even the smallest apartment house costs $50,000 or $60,000. You must listen carefully, sir." Natalie Xavier was very dismissive of this kind of person who was overconfident and maliciously delayed time. Well, Chuck Cannon didn't finish his words. At this time, a pot-bellied man walked into the real estate agent. The gold necklace on his neck was thicker than his fingers, and he looked like a rich man at first glance. Natalie immediately chose to leave Chuck aside and greeted the man with a smile. It was totally different from the way she treated Chuck. When Natalie saw the fat man, she immediately put on a happy smile. "Sir, do you want to buy a house?" "Yes, I want to buy a house. Introduce some high-quality housing sources to me." Natalie smiled even more happily. Yes, we have plenty of high-quality rooms here for you with our high-end service. Unlike some people who come to us even when they can't afford it. It's a waste of time." Natalie gave Chuck a disdainful look as she spoke, implying and cursing him. Chuck looked at Natalie's attitude and felt disheartened. He was used to being looked down upon. At that time, he didn't dare to say anything without money. But this time, he had $5 million. How could he swallow such humiliation? "Where's your manager? Call your manager over." Hearing Chuck's words, Natalie sneered and said, Do people like you still have the right to meet our manager? Don't make a fool of yourself here. Get out of here. Do you know that wasting 1 minute of our time will affect how much money we make? The manager walked over slowly at this time. As a service industry, it was a big taboo to be rude to guests. What's going on, Natalie? Natalie hurriedly explained, Manager, this broke idiot isn't trying to buy a house, but instead he's enjoying the air conditioning here. I'll get him out of here immediately. The manager eyeballed Chuck's clothes from top to bottom and saw that he was dressed in ordinary clothes. Indeed, as Natalie said, he didn't look like someone who could afford to buy a house. More importantly, he was too young to buy a house as he looked just 18 or 19 years old. No one would believe he had the ability to. Chuck did not say anything. He stood up and walked to the agency next door. Can't afford a house. It seems that you are not the only real estate agency here. Natalie looked down on him. How is a poor person like you able to buy a house? I think you can't even afford a toilet. Some employees also laughed at him. He's afraid of making a fool of himself, so he found an excuse to run away quickly. He said he wanted to go next door, but he could possibly just be trying to take advantage of the air conditioning there too. Still pretending even when you're gone, Natalie sneered. They were familiar with the next door real estate agency and they also knew whether they could sell it or not. After watching Chuck leave, Natalie hurriedly ran to the fatty and smiled apologetically. I'm sorry, boss. Sorry to keep you waiting. The fatty shook his head and said, It's okay. However, no matter how Natalie greeted him with a smile, the fatty never talked about money. In the end, Natalie's patience was exhausted, and she even began to plead. At this moment, all the employees of the real estate agency looked outside. Under the respectful guidance of the staff next door, Chuck got into the Mercedes-Benz, which was specially used to look at the room. What was going on? Generally speaking, only people who bought a house could enter this car. Didn't the next-door real estate agency see that this little rascal didn't have the ability to buy a house at all? The fatty saw that these people in the real estate agency were distracted, so he quickly sneaked out. Natalie turned around and looked at the customer who had disappeared. She was so angry that she stomped her feet. She didn't expect that the fatty who was putting on airs and graces was actually here just to enjoy the air conditioner. Natalie Xavier looked at Chuck and disliked him even more. She sneered and said, such a pretentious person, and even imitating others to inspect a house. At this time, an employee next door came quickly. He pushed the door open and said with a smile, Thank you. You sent such an important customer to our company. We haven't run into any big business in the past 2 years. Today is a big day. Important customer. The manager's face darkened and he hurriedly asked, What did he buy? He bought a house worth more than $3 million with a deposit of $1 million. This business should be successful. Thank you. I'll treat you to a cup of milk tea later. After that, the employee got on the Mercedes-Benz and took Chuck to take a look at the house. Really? Bought it? Natalie's face was full of disbelief. Looking at Chuck, who was sitting in the Mercedes-Benz with a smile on his face, Natalie felt very uncomfortable. How could it be possible? He is so poor, how could he possibly afford to buy a house? Smack. Before she could blame herself, the manager raised his hand and slapped her in the face. His eyes were almost bursting out flames. Look at what you have done. If the transaction is successful, the employees who have dealt with him will be given a 5% commission, which would be around $150,000. As for the manager, he would have gotten a 10% commission amounting to $300,000. But now, the manager trembled with anger when he thought of the commission of $300,000 gone with the wind. He kicked Natalie again and said, Get out! You're fired. Get out. Natalie was also losing her mind. Ignoring the pain on her body, she quickly got up from the ground and ran outside. Then throwing herself whole at the BMW, she knocked on the window repeatedly and looked at Chuck, sobbing. Sir, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I failed to recognize your wealth before and I'm a snob. Please give me another chance. We have better houses here. Chuck shook his head and said, It's all right. You can save it for the other customers. After that, the Mercedes-Benz started up in a hurry. Natalie chased after him all the way and finally sat down on the ground. She looked weakly at the Mercedes-Benz getting farther and farther away. Thud. The manager threw Natalie's personal belongings out of the door and yelled at her, "Get out of here! Don't let me see you again." Chuck Cannon was quite satisfied with the house. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 living rooms, and 2 bathrooms. Located in the downtown area, the business district was more prosperous and there was a lot of room for renovation. $3.5 million was paid in a lump sum graciously. The salesman had not seen such a rich man for a long time, and his face was full of admiration and envy. He then took the initiative to send Chuck back to university. When he arrived at the gate, Chuck nodded and said, "You can drop me off here." The salesman smiled respectfully and said, "All right, take your time, good sir. The process of transferring the house should be completed tomorrow, and you should be able to move in the day after tomorrow." "Okay." Chuck nodded and decided to stay at the nearest hotel for the time being for the next 2 days. However, he wanted to know more was what Yvette Jordan would feel if she saw that his house was 3 or 4 times bigger than hers. When they arrived at the gate, Chuck first took out $20,000 before strolling into the university. There were not many classes in the afternoon, but Chuck had already been absent for a whole class because he had been held up outside for a while. Seeing Chuck walking into the classroom, Laura Jean sneered, "Oh, who is this? Isn't this Chuck, the beggar of our class? I'm telling you, don't lend your money to such a person. When you lend him money, he acts as though you're his savior and bows to you. However, when you try to get the money back from him, he acts shamelessly like a scam trying to cheat off your money. Speaking of which, he hasn't even paid me back until now." "Oh, this guy doesn't have parents. Who knows which bastard he learnt these tactics from?" The whole class burst into laughter. Chapter 3. They all knew that Chuck Cannon was a poor man, as he only seemed to wear 2 different shirts all year round. Although there was no strange smell, the clothes were already so faded and torn that they were simply unsightly. Someone asked, "Laura Jean, how much does he owe you?" $400. "It's only a day's expenses for me, but for him, maybe a month. Putting aside how much he owes me, this kind of person is really disgusting. He doesn't even deserve to lick my shoes." Chuck's expression was indifferent. He looked at Laura and took out $400 from his bag, saying, "I'll return you the money now. I was really grateful when you were willing to lend me some money when I was starving, but you just slandered me. Let's call it even now." Laura frowned and looked at the $400 in his hand. She asked coldly, "Where did you get the money? Did you steal it or rob it?" Someone said, "Let's look at our pockets to see if we're short of money." "I earned it myself," Chuck said calmly. "You," Laura sneered and said, "Why don't you look in the mirror before saying something so outrageous? How can you earn yourself $400 in the morning? Did you sell your body or something?" The whole class burst into laughter and said, "I'm afraid that this guy is not worth so much money even if he goes to sell his body." Seeing as so many students laughed at him in the classroom, Chuck sighed and sat back in his seat. "Laura, you should be easier on people." Laura snorted and put the money away. "Then tell me what you have done. Answer some of our questions." Chuck frowned for a long time and made up an excuse. He said casually, "I picked up the money." "Oh, lucky, eh?" Laura smirked, her malicious tone showing some envy. The other students also asked with jealousy, "Hey, how much did you pick up?" Many people were interested and asked one after another, "Yes, tell me, how much did you pick up?" Chuck was speechless. He stared back at his classmates and continued to lie. $2,000. "What? You actually picked up $2,000? Damn it, that's my living expenses for more than a month." All the students were surprised and envied him very much. If they had his luck and picked up $2,000, their lives would be much more comfortable and easier. Phew, suck. Picking up other people's money and claiming them as your own. Such embarrassment for our class. When these classmates ridiculed Chuck because of jealousy, Queenie Carson was the only one who stood up for him in the class. But Chuck didn't care about such gossip and rumors, so he just let them talk about it. After class, Chuck went to Yvette Jordan's staff room. Because there was no class in the afternoon, Yvette was listening to music in the staff room. When she saw Chuck, her expression soured. "What are you doing here? Didn't I tell you that you are not allowed to look for me in between classes?" Chuck said with a wry smile. I just want to tell you that I'm going to move out today. You want to move out? Are you kidding? Yvette sneered. Since young, she had grown up with Chuck. Knowing him like the back of her hand, how could he move out? Easy want to sleep on the street? But he had been timid since he was a child, even insisting to use her as his body pillow when sleeping. If it weren't for the death of his grandfather, God knows how much longer she would have to be hugged by him to sleep. Such a person sleeping on the street, they wouldn't dare to do that even if he had 10 times the courage. I am not joking with you. I'll move out today, Chuck said seriously. Well, I'd like to see how long you can. Don't come back begging to me like a dog. I won't. After Chuck finished speaking, he turned around and left the office. Yvette stared at his leaving figure thoughtfully. In the past, no matter how much she scolded him, he would not dare to talk back. She didn't know what happened to him today. All of a sudden, her phone rang. After picking up the phone, she quickly changed her tone and answered, "Hello, Director Chester. What happened for you to suddenly call me up like this?" A middle-aged man's voice could be heard from the other end of the phone. "Yvette, I heard that your training company's business is not good recently. You want me to introduce some business to you?" Yvette's heart was filled with joy. Her recent business in the training company could be said to be very poor. It was already very difficult for her to make any progress. If she did not show any improvement again, she was afraid that she would have to close the company in half a year. She had already lost more than $100,000 in the past 2 months. It was also because of this that she was recently venting all her anger on Chuck. After hearing Director Chester's business proposals, a smile appeared on her face. "Yes, thank you for taking care of me, Director Chester. Well, room number 1218 in the Triumph Hotel tonight. Come over." A hotel. Yvette was a little scared. Director Chester, why don't I treat you to a 5-star hotel dinner in the urban area?" "A hotel? What's wrong? You don't even give me face?" No, it's just a hotel." Instantly, a steel-cold voice was heard from the phone. "Forget it if you don't come, Biz. Forget it if you don't come. It is a curse. This business is given by my friend's company as his employees need to be trained. You should know how much money you can make from a big company with 50 to 60 people. If you don't come, I won't force you." Yvette was very conflicted. She didn't want to go, but she didn't want to waste this opportunity either. Just when she had wanted to negotiate, he hung up all of a sudden. "If I don't take the deal, I'm afraid that I'll be going bankrupt." She decided to take the risk. After leaving school, she drove home, planning to simply tidy up and change her clothes. However, when she just arrived at the door of the house, she saw Chuck coming out of the house with a suitcase. The two of them looked at each other. Chuck said, "Wifey." As soon as he spoke, Yvette interrupted him with disgust. "Don't call me like that. Yvette, no matter what, you've been taking care of me for almost a year after Grandpa's death. Yvette snorted and said, "What's wrong? Do you regret it? Do you want me to give you a chance?" Yvette sneered impatiently. "No, I mean, if you have any difficulties in the future, you can tell me." Chuck nodded before walking past Yvette. After all, he and Yvette had been sleeping in the same bed for so long. He still had some feelings for her in his heart. Yvette was also absent-minded for a moment. She didn't expect that this man, whom she looked down upon the most, would say such comforting words today. It was as though in a trance she had found someone to rely upon, but then she smiled coldly and said, "Tell you? What good would it bring me to tell you? Can you give me money or bring me some customers? You can't give me anything, and you can't even afford a meal, yet you want me to tell you." Chuck shrugged. He still had more than $1 million in his hand. Even if it was not enough, he still had his mother. The money would be transferred to his account with just a phone call. "If you need money, I can give it to you." Yvette feebly waved her hand and sneered, "You'd better keep the money for yourself to buy instant noodles." Chuck did not defend himself. He left with his suitcase. Chuck walked with his suitcase for a while. After inquiring about the hotels nearby, he got on a taxi and went to the Triumph Hotel. The magnificent buildings, the glorious decorations, and the luxurious European interiors shocked him to his core. This was the busiest hotel in the city, which cheapest standard hotel rooms cost at least $800. In the past, Chuck did not dare to think that he could spend in such a place, but now it was different. When Chuck was about to go in, he saw Yvette's car swerving in and parking itself in the parking lot. Chuck was so shocked that he hid aside in a hurry. This is a hotel. What is she doing here? Chuck felt extremely bitter in his heart. Is his wifey going to sleep with another man? Although the two of them didn't get a marriage certificate and it was just Grandpa's arrangement, he felt very uncomfortable when he thought that the woman he once held in his arms was going to sleep with others. After Yvette went in, Chuck took his luggage and walked in. As soon as he entered the door, he heard a strange voice saying, "Oh my God, who is this? Isn't this Chuck?" Chuck turned his head and found Laura strolling in with her boyfriend, Conrad Lee, in her arms. Laura's face was full of scorn, as if Chuck was not qualified to come to such a high-end hotel. "Who is this?" Conrad glanced at Chuck and asked casually. "Chuck Cannon, my classmate, I'm telling you. This person picked up $2,000, but he didn't return it and instead spent it himself. I really admire this kind of person." Conrad glanced at Chuck, the corners of his mouth twitching in sarcasm. Maybe such a trash hasn't seen $2,000 before. Don't talk nonsense with this kind of rubbish. Let's go in quickly, my dear. Laura held Conrad's arm tightly in her arms as if she couldn't wait to enter the hotel. Chuck frowned slightly and ignored them, dragging his luggage into the hotel. "A standard room, please." Conrad took out his identity card, and Laura followed suit shyly. The pretty staff at the front desk checked on the hotel's database and said, "I'm sorry, today's standard room has been fully booked." "Ah." Laura's face was full of dissatisfaction and loss. Conrad continued to ask, "How about a larger room? I'm really sorry." The pretty staff at the front desk checked again, her tone extremely apologetic. "Only the presidential suite is currently available." Conrad probed carefully. "The presidential suite? How much is that?" He said so in a hesitant tone. For them, they would usually get a standard room that costs a few $100s every time they got a room. As students, it was already pretty extravagant for them to spend a few $100s like this. "Yes, it's $8,888 for the presidential suite." Conrad shook his head hurriedly. "It's way too expensive." "Forget it, let's go find another hotel." Laura muttered and pulled Conrad out. But before they went out, they saw Chuck walking to the front desk. This rubbish really thinks that he is rich after picking up $2,000. Just look at his beggar-looking clothes. How dare he try to book a room in this kind of place? Laura sneered. Conrad also sneered. He was pretty sure that this guy had most $2,000 on him. He would definitely be shocked to death once he heard the price for a night in the presidential suite. However, how's that even possible? Conrad's mind was filled with doubt as he watched Chuck walking towards the elevator with the room card in his hand. What's going on? Wasn't there no standard room? How did that trash Chuck Cannon manage to get a room? Laura Jean saw it too, and she became more and more annoyed. She walked quickly to the front desk and patted it hard, asking defiantly, "Hey, didn't you just say that there was no standard room left? Why did you let that person book one then? Call your manager. I'm going to make a complaint that you are cheating your customers." Conrad's face was cold too. After all, he was a VIP member of this hotel. How could he be fooled by such a receptionist? He was full of anger. "Hurry up and call out your manager." The girl at the front desk was stunned. After a long pause, she said helplessly, "You two misunderstood me. The standard rooms are indeed all fully booked. The room that the person has booked just now is the presidential suite." "How is it possible?" Laura's face changed before she retorted hurriedly, "It's impossible. How can that broke idiot afford to book a presidential suite?" The girl at the front desk handed over the receipt, which was issued just now. When the two of them saw the payment fee, their faces changed dramatically. Could it be that he picked up more than $2,000, probably $20,000? Conrad could only think of such a possibility. It's very likely. Laura was even more jealous. That broke idiot actually picked up $20,000. This was almost her living expenses for 1 year. What a stroke of luck. He is really good at spending money, picking up $20,000 and spending half of it lavishly, such a spendthrift. Laura was bitter, and her face was full of discontent. Idiots are still idiots. He probably thinks that he is rich with that little sum of money. $20,000 is my dad's income for 3 or 4 days, but my dad will never waste it by booking a presidential suite. How dare a broke idiot like him even spend his slim stroke of luck like this? Hilarious. Conrad laughed disdainfully. Chuck placed his luggage in his room and went downstairs to eat. When Laura saw Chuck coming down from the elevator, she thought of something and whispered, "This loser likes to show off right. Why don't we play around with him for a while?" Conrad was puzzled, but how? Laura smiled and shouted at Chuck, "Hey Chuck,